Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to another Historians interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is a guest making technically their third appearance on my show, as well as my second appearance on YouTube. And I'm so excited to have this guest back on the show. Now, for those who remember this incredible guest, she is a respected historian and writer known for her modern approach to historical narratives. Originally from Illinois, she relocated to East Tennessee after earning her bachelor's degree in history, followed by a magna cum laude master's degree from Southern New Hampshire University back in 2020. Her scholarly work has been featured in ProQuest, the Historians magazine, Exploring History, and Frame of Reference. Her thesis, The Divided Electorate of Tennessee During the American Civil War and the Subsequent Civilian Consequences, is cataloged in the Library of Congress, demonstrating her commitment to rigorous research. Specializing in women's history, she runs the website Remember the Ladies, where she highlights the contributions of women throughout history and shares positive messages with her readers. She blends historical scholarship with contemporary insight that makes her a significant voice in academic and public history circles. And she is also the published author of the incredible historical book, which focuses on some of the most powerful women from the continent of Africa. Some familiar names, such as, of course, Cleopatra, to some lesser known names, such as the Queen of the Nubians, who is arguably one of my favorite queens from the continent of Africa. And to tell us all that and more, as well as some new and exciting projects on the way, let's give a huge round of applause to our returning guest, historian and author, Katy Clark. Katy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me here again.
Awesome, Katy. I am so excited to have you back on the show. And again, congratulations on the success of the book with Pen and Sword. I know last time you were back on the show, you were still in the process of finishing up the final edits before it went into publication. So again, a huge congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So before we dive into this interview, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners an update of what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show a year ago?
So since we last spoke, I was in the middle of writing African Women of the Ancient World, Queens, Consorts, and Warriors. I have since submitted that manuscript. It has been published, and I think Pen and Sword did such a great job on this cover. She's such a beautiful woman. And on the back is also featured, there are the women that I talked about. And that being said, I'm glad that you brought up Cleopatra, because she actually is not present in this book because she is from Macedonia. So I didn't want to confuse my readers and think that I put someone who is of Greek origin into this book. But there are 9 fascinating women that everyone can read about in this book. And since that time, I've been busy trying to promote the book. I've actually been on my second book. I'm writing that currently for Pen and Sword that does highlight ancient Greek women. Cleopatra is not in this one as well, but there are several women that are what I would say maybe lost to time a little bit, or maybe misunderstood, that I'm hoping to bring back out into the spotlight, as well as diving into some of those really fantastic Greek mythology stories.
Nice, amazing. Well, I cannot wait to read that when it comes out. And as I said off camera, I really do hope you continue this, because this has the makings of an incredible series. You could quite literally go to every continent, every major empire in human history and explore some of the powerful women and also forgotten women of history and give them back their voice and their agency, because honestly, that is a huge thing that I think we need. We need a little bit more voices that have been forgotten to the history books. And I cannot wait for that to come out. And again, huge congratulations to the women of classical Africa. Again, a huge success to you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I guess let's dive right in. So also from your bio, history has been integral with you for a very long time. You got your bachelor's from East Tennessee, magna cum laude from Southern New Hampshire University. Your work is in the Library of Congress. You've been published numerous times on so many different media. Here's a fun little question. Looking back on your journey thus far as an historian, have you ever thought to yourself how different your whole life would be if you did not pursue history as your main driving point, your focal point?
It's history has been such a huge part of my life for so long that I can't imagine what it would be like if that wasn't something that captivated me every day, just because it's been so ingrained in me since I was maybe 6. So I don't know what life would look like.
That's fair. That is very, very fair. It is kind of interesting to see like how different our lives would be, the big what ifs. And of course, that also falls into history because we would have to change aspects of our lives. But I definitely think, maybe for the best, we don't think of like the what ifs because there's a reason we are put on this path as historians, as writers, especially now more than ever. So let's do a little refresh into, taking your passion for history and making it into a career. So after graduating with your degrees in history, how did the website come about? Remember the Ladies. And would you consider that to be your aha moment where you wanted to take your passion for history and really build your brand from it?
I would say the original aha moment for history for me was back when I was 6 years old, when I was sitting on my grandfather's couch and we were watching a program about World War I, which is incredibly complex, very way larger to understand than a 6-year-old can really comprehend. But my grandfather explained it to me in a way that was very simplistic and I can understand it. And then from that day, I had to know all about it. So that's where it first began. But I will say, after I graduated and I had spent several courses that dealt with women's history, that's where that passion really started to come about because, we have these components of history that we've been taught our whole lives. Like for us that do live in America, we know about the founding fathers. We know about the major battles that contributed into the America that we see today. And those are all fascinating topics. However, the world is such a big place. And there's so many different people and places and eras and cultures that, for people that don't look like us, or don't look like me. And I wanted to dive into those. So the website, Remember the Ladies, is where I like to showcase those women because there's no shortage of topics.
Right. And I think you may have mentioned this in your last interview on the show, but maybe just as a refresher. When did the idea of writing a book come about? Because as mentioned in your bio, you've written a lot of scholarly work for the Historians magazine, Exploring History, and so forth. But to write a book, to dedicate a good portion of your time to do research and to craft an outline, that takes a lot of commitment. So can you share with us the inspiration, or rather the moment where you decided that you wanted to do something completely outside of your comfort zone?
So that first happened. I was writing for the Historians magazine, and I wanted to contribute to their Black History Month edition. So I chose to write about Harriet Tubman and her Combahee Ferry raid on the rice plantations. And so I wrote this article, I submitted it to the magazine, and it was published, and I just kind of went on with my life doing more research. Well, the editor, her name is Rosie, she contacted me and said, "Hey, my contact at Pen and Sword Books really enjoyed your article on Harriet Tubman, and she is wondering if I could give your contact information. She is thinking of maybe pursuing a book with you at Pen and Sword. Are you interested?" And I was, "Yes, please." So I got an email a few weeks later from my editor. Her name was Corinne at Pen and Sword, and she said, "Hey, I really enjoyed this article. What would you think about focusing on women of color, particularly African women, and just give me a list?" And it was a very broad list. It didn't stick to any particular era. It was just, there was maybe 20 women, and then we kind of condensed from there. And I emailed her and said, "I'm really drawn to women of antiquity. Do you think we could focus on that? Because the farther you go back in history, the more of those women are susceptible to being forgotten or misunderstood." So I wanted to focus on that. And it was definitely a labor of love, because there's a lot of primary sources that need to be sifted through, and then the secondary sources that really are, another historian's interpretation of what's been written about in those ancient times. And it was 14 months of rigorous research and writing.
Yes, that is absolutely true. I would imagine, as you said, doing the research, creating the outline to really do justice, but also make sure you can get every piece of information. And I'm sure you'll definitely agree, researching to the classical antiquities period, depending on where geographically you're looking at, can be very, very intimidating and sometimes, not easy, especially if you're looking at women of color, specifically your research of African women during the classical age. It was probably tough. It was probably very, very intimidating. And I'm actually very curious. This actually is a fan question one of my viewers wanted to ask. As you said earlier, you had a very large list of prospective candidates that you wanted to focus on, and then it narrowed down. From the modified list, who is probably your favorite to research and really explore? And the follow-up to that is, of the original list, who did you really want to include, but knew it was going to be a challenge to write about them?
Okay, so going back to the first question, my favorite, and that is so hard because they really added their own flair each to this book. But I would say my favorite probably would have been Amani Reynas of the Kingdom of Kush.
Yes.
I find her brazenness so inspiring, and they all had their victories and their failures, and they all were very fun to write about and definitely challenging for sure. But I think she was probably my favorite. And the broader piece of it, because we had originally talked, my editor and we had talked about including female African-American spies. And I wanted to include Harriet Tubman. I wanted to include, Susie Baker King, but it just wasn't appropriate to do so because, one, it didn't fit within the genre of this book, but they're also very far outside of the antiquity realm that this book mainly focuses on. And the queens that are in here that are of a modern age, they more closely tie into the women that are of ancient origins. So it just wasn't appropriate to put them in.
Right. Now, as for the second part of that question, from your original group and possibly from the modified version you and your editor worked on, who was probably the most difficult to get sources on?
That would be Makeda of Sheba. And a big part of that is because a lot of the ancient Sabaean text wasn't really found until the last maybe decade and a half.
Really?
For a long time, Makeda was considered really just another mythological being until the Sabaean texts from that ancient kingdom of Sheba was found in Jerusalem. I believe it was back in 2012 when excavations were really coming around, and they found clay pots and seals and things that had that ancient Sabaean text on it, which validated the time frame in which she would have traveled to see King Solomon.
Fascinating. Very, very fascinating. And when you were writing this book, as well as your other scholarly work that you worked on in your career, ultimately, what has been your goal as an historian and writer, as well as the promise you're making to anyone who reads your work?
I want people to be able to take away an appreciation for how far along humankind has come and our capability to continue to move forward without, or with a sound moral compass. Um, Learning from humankind's sins of the past, and it's not so much to condemn, but to learn from those things. And I believe it's essential to learn the histories of people and cultures, whether they look like us or not, because it really does integrate into how we view the world and how we treat people around us. So
Mhm.
and there is something with the feedback on this book. It's been overwhelmingly positive, which I so appreciate. But there was one where she was a little bit perturbed that I didn't outwardly condemn some
Mm.
of the actions in this book by Rena Valona the First. She was also known as Rena Valona the Cruel and the
Mm.
Mad Queen of Madagascar. And I think it's important for people to understand that we as historians, our job is not to insert our subjective opinion or our moral compass into the narratives
That's
that we're
right.
writing about. We have to remain as objective as possible. And that's something I would really like readers to know, is that we are responsible for recording histories consistent with the truth. So
Yes.
that's a big part of it.
That is very, very true. And also like to add to that, you are absolutely right that we as historians, our job is to record the truth and not put our own biases and our own values. But I also like to go a step forward and say when it comes to the research that we gather, sometimes, depending on the source, we do have to take it with a grain of salt because we don't know when these sources were written, like what was the mindset of the people who wrote it. So we have to take it with a grain of salt and look at other sources to see, okay, what aren't they telling us? And then extrapolate from numerous sources to try to get the best clear picture. Because I'm pretty sure that the histories that we know now, that was probably taken from 99% across the board from different scholars, different histories, and so forth. So it's a very, very strenuous but very fulfilling job as an historian. Now, again, in regards to your book, Katy, when you began writing it, this is another fan question. What really surprised you about the idea of being a published author? And what I mean by that is you already were published in magazines in that regard, but to actually hold like a physical copy of something that you've worked on, that people know that this is you, this is your research, you did all the hard work with, of course, your editors and researchers, but this is 100% you. What really surprised you about that milestone in your career and your life?
It was kind of surreal. It's one thing to be published in a magazine, which is a wonderful accomplishment, but
Mhm.
a book is a bit larger in scale, and it does require a lengthier time of research. It requires many, many, many late nights, and
Mhm.
not just the research process, but also editing and backing up your research with more context from other sources, not just one. So it was a very involved process, far more than what would go into writing an article for a magazine or one of the online forums that has published my work. So it was definitely a surreal thing to actually hold the book in my hand.
Very true. Very, very true. And this kind of leads into a fun little question, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on, Katie, is as historians who are writers, or we are writers in general, we dedicate a lot of our time doing research, trying to craft something that's engaging and informative. But there are days where we can't write. We get all the research, but we don't know what to write. We don't know the starting point. We don't know what's going to be the main idea. And sometimes it can be very frustrating. And we have to sometimes take a step back. So for you, Katie, in your career as an historian and as a writer, have you ever had moments of writer's block? And if so, what did you do to counter it and, just work past it?
I have definitely had moments of writer's block, and they are probably some of the most frustrating occurrences for a writer and for a historian, because for me, when I'm writing something, I want the words to matter, not just to me, but to the people reading my book. I want them to know why they're reading what I wrote. And if I can't make something interesting, or it's just not, the words are not flowing, I'm not finding the right words to get my point across, I really do need to take a step back. And that could be for a very short period of time. Maybe my brain is just a little bit fatigued from coming out of such hard research and then going into the writing process. I need to just take maybe 20-30 minutes for a break. And sometimes the writer's block will come in between. I'm
Mhm.
writing, and then all of a sudden it's just not happening anymore, and I need to take a step back. Sometimes I need to put the work away for the evening and then come back to it the next day when I'm maybe feeling a little bit more rested.
Absolutely. Very, very true. Very, very true. And apologies, 1 second, just gotta close my door. Again, I 100% have to agree, Katie. I have done similar things when I've written my own articles as well. There have been nights where I've written probably 3 articles, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting to not only just do the research, but sometimes to organize, the layouts for the maps, the little blurbs that go underneath each image, where you get the sources, all that stuff. It's been exhausting sometimes, and I've had to take step backs and realize, okay, I cannot take on too much. Even though I know I can, I shouldn't, because I want this to be the best work that I can be. I want to show people this is me, this is what I can do, and stuff like that. And now this goes into some reflective questions, which I think I've asked you before, but now I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on it and see if they've changed. So, one thing that I found very interesting, especially in today's age, is being an historian in the digital era is vastly different than it was 20 years ago. And, historians, of course, have their websites, their newsletters, or their thesis that have been, used in publications, everything like that. But now more than ever, social media has allowed historians a platform to really showcase, who they are. And you've also seen a lot of history enthusiasts and history bloggers take social media and, really explode and help the history field entirely. But this has sparked a very interesting discussion, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on, Katie. And that is, of course, the term the armchair historian. Now, I've had a lot of people on the show who have been a mixture of traditionally trained academic historians and those who may not have a history degree, but they are very passionate about history. And we've talked about, what does it mean to be an historian? And for me, and this is my own opinion, viewers and listeners, my view is this: if you are passionate about history, if you are focused on telling the truth and, showing everything, including the negative sides of it, but giving context to it, you're an historian. For me, that is the bottom line. But of course, not everyone thinks that way. And there's been this huge shift and kind of like little mini conflict between classically trained historians who are trained in academia and those that are passionate about history from an enthusiast perspective and making content on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, what have you. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Katie, and for you to give your opinions and your thoughts on what does it mean to be an historian in the digital age.
So I do agree with you that someone who is passionate about history and does seek to portray it in its accuracy does have the makings of being a historian. I think that there is a separation between the two, between being a history enthusiast and a historian. The difference, and the training does have value in it, having come from a master's where we're trained to refine our craft and know exactly where our forte or our niche is going to be in this field. But there is some valuable training in how we document, how we find our sources, how to actually gut those sources to see if the information is credible, if it's
Hmm.
backed up by other historians, or if it's full of a subjective opinion, which if I find those sources, I don't even use them because it's not credible to me.
Right.
But someone who is passionate about history and they really are enthusiastic about it, they want to keep those memories and those stories and those cultures alive. I think that they do have the makings of being a historian, but I do think that it does involve a little bit more of a training, because it's a very serious thing that we do, and we have to make sure that we're documenting accurately. So that's kind of where my take is on it. But I think that people that do want to get more into the history field, they don't necessarily have to go to college for it, but there are a lot of great resources that you can find
Hmm.
either online or in your local bookstores that do talk about the historian's craft. And I encourage anyone who's wanting to be in this field to dive into that, to become a historian with or without the college education.
Absolutely. And this kind of goes follow up to that, as with social media, it's definitely been used. Well, social media is a tool that can be used for good and sometimes for bad. And when it comes to history, there are a lot of great content that I follow that really fascinates me. But then there are also times where people use it to talk about history, but don't either cite the sources or they tweak it, as you said, to suit their own world views. And while this has not happened to anyone that I have known personally, being an historian in the digital age can be intimidating because, sometimes we post our content on social media and there may be some instances where, people will call us out, dispute our research, consider us frauds. And that has to be a decision of, do we engage it or we just let it slide? And sometimes it can be very exhausting. And I would just like to hear your thoughts again, Kitty, on, that aspect of, you know, always wondering, are people going to call us out on our research? And if you in your career, if you've ever experienced moments like, imposter syndrome or heightened anxiety or anything like that, especially when it came to writing your book.
Yes. So I think as historians, we should always be aware that there's going to be a critic out there somewhere who is either not going to agree with our research, or they're not going to appreciate the writing style. They're not going to agree with the conclusions that we've made. And that's the background of history going back forever.
Hmm.
There's always a critic out there somewhere. And I definitely have received a very small a very small share of my criticisms coming in, but they are very few. And it's usually from someone who thinks that they've researched it more than I have, and I haven't seen anything to back that up. So I take it with a grain of salt. I stand by my research, so I don't internalize those things very much. I know my background, and I know all of the sources that I use to validate what I wrote in my book, and I do stand by them. So I don't have anxieties about it. I don't like to give people that power,
Mm.
especially when I did work so hard on this, and I'm really, really proud of the accomplishment, and I can't wait for people to meet these women. So there is someone out there, there always will be. And if someone comes to me with a sound argument that maybe they came up with a different conclusion based on their research, I would be more than happy to discuss that with them. But usually in the digital age, people just post something, and that's kind of that.
Absolutely. And here's actually another fan question one of my viewers asked, and this actually refers to the queens in your book. And my viewer wants to know, as the author and as the primary researcher, how did you ensure that your research highlighted the complexities of these powerful women, but also maintaining the authenticity of your voice as the author and researcher, but also the authenticity of these women?
So when I'm researching, I'm not singularly researching on these women. They're a part of a much bigger picture.
Mm,
And so when I did research, it wasn't just on the women, it was also about the specific cultures that they came from.
mm,
Those countries, what do people eat there? What is their music like? Do they like the arts? Do they like to dance? What were the main trading items back in that time period? So it all goes into context, and that's something that one of the reviewers said they really appreciated, is that it wasn't just about these women, because they did not exist in solidarity. They were among a massive group of people, and they led whole nations, whole kingdoms.
mhm.
So when I do research, it's not just that particular person. It is, where did they really come from, and what would have been their major influences.
Nice.
And then I craft, the narrative to explain in the best way possible, consistent with the truth, giving historical context, while also making sure the reader can stay engaged.
Nice. And that actually goes to another follow-up fan question, which another one of my viewers asked, what were some of the biggest stereotypes or myths that you've discovered in your research? And did these myths exist for a long period in terms of they were the truth as, the finite until they were disproven?
I'm not sure there is so much myth apart from Makita of Sheba, and I do talk about that in my book. And like I said, the farther you go back, and sometimes a lot of things are lost. And so the only one that really has a true mythological tale would be her. And I can't
Mm,
say that it's it's able to be proven, just like any other historical mythological narrative. Um, so it's not so much trying to debunk the myth, more so is just educating on what has been written about this particular woman and why,
right.
like any other culture.
Nice. So to almost to reiterate, so you want to try to fill in the gaps as best you could to try to paint the most accurate picture of this queen who, for many people have believed to be just some folk figure or mythological figure, but you want to say there's probably some truth to her story, and I'm going to do my best to really showcase this and highlight this. Going back to what you said before, not just showing that she existed, but the kingdom that she was a part of, the culture that she represented also existed as well. And I think that is a beautiful thing, Katie. I think that is incredible. So now let's talk about the business side of being an author and being an historian. So when your book was finished and it was edited and published, I imagine, again, huge moment, huge milestone in your career. Looking back on the initial launch, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of marketing your book?
Hmm. I think that I would have pursued reaching out to local bookstores a little bit sooner. It's a fine line on how you approach bookstores, and at least here where I live in the country in East Tennessee, there's more of a focus on local and state history than there
Mhm.
is world history. So that's kind of been a little bit of an obstacle that I'm still pursuing to overcome. But um, I think I would have reached out a little bit sooner. But
Mm,
it's the first book, so definitely learning the ropes here.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think also from that point, that goes into the next question, which is understanding our audience. Now, just as authors, as historians, we have to understand that, you know, our audience is going to be those that are just like us, those who have done the research, who know the jargon that we are talking about, and so forth. But when we're writing to the general public, that tends to shift differently because we want it to be engaging, we want it to be exciting, but we don't want the jargon to push the reader away so that way they won't understand. And I imagine when writing your book, Katie, as well as going into your second book, that was a lot of trial and error to really stay true to your voice as the historian and the researcher, but also writing differently as you would from a thesis paper back in university. So ultimately, can you tell us that process of finding your voice as the author and as a historian, balancing these two to where we get like an equilibrium of who you are, the author and the historian?
So the historian is the person who is, they have their nose to the grindstone. They are sifting through all of those primary and secondary sources. They are weeding out the ones that are not going to aid in that research or that story whatsoever, making sure everything is consistent with the truth. They're very, we're focused, and I was focused. When it comes to actually writing the book, that's when you start really thinking about what is the audience going to want to hear. And the last thing, at least from my perspective, that people would want to hear, they don't want to read what feels like another dusty textbook. People want to be told the story. So that does happen to be my writing style. I do write it in a way that is almost tangible to the reader, I think. They can understand it's layman's terms. It's not full of a bunch of words that the general public is not going to understand, because when you do that, it's important and it does have its place in the historical community. But for the audience that I was reaching, I'm wanting to reach a broader audience, I needed to write in a way that was easy to understand, but also inserted those very important points that I was making. And I do think that it was a success.
Nice. And as a follow-up to that, what would you, or I should say, who do you consider your audience to be? Fellow historians who are academics, history enthusiasts, or that nice equilibrium, a mixture of both?
It would be a mixture of both. My audience is anyone who wishes to really dive into who these women were, the cultures they came from, the events of, that impacted world history, and also just the history of those specific places and times. Their influence stretched far beyond their nation's borders, and far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. So but yes, they had massive influence. So we're talking about valuable trade routes, military battles fought over land and power, including the Atlantic slave trade. And so there's a lot of very sensitive topics in this book, but there really is something for everyone.
Very true. That is absolutely very true. And this goes into a discussion that I love talking to historians about, because I definitely think this needs to be talked about, which is, as historians, we have to understand, for those that want to pursue a career in history, there's traditionally only two lanes for us. We either go down the way of being an educator, or we work in some kind of government job. And I'm not throwing shade to either of these two careers. These are very important and they are necessary. But all I am saying is that not everyone wants to be a teacher. Not everyone wants to work in a government occupation. They want to go down that middle path. And that path is very, very difficult. And to give a personal example of this, when I was in my last 6 months of my master's program at San Francisco State, I had the opportunity to go to a workshop, and it was entitled Turning Our Careers into Passions and Turning Our Passions into Careers. And that shows how historians or people and students in the history field can take their passion for history, couple it with something else about themselves, whether it's artistry or video editing or anything, and building a career from it. And the one that really stood out to me was, of course, an historian who was an award-winning author. He used his passion for history as well as his passion for writing to build a career from it. And that, for me, has been the biggest inspiration and motivating factor for me to pursue my passion for history and my passion for writing. And of course, that led to the creation of my books, one of them being, of course, Son of Persia. Though speculative fiction, I do really showcase the historian side of who I am. Since my background is in classical antiquities, I want to really showcase what life was like back then. And I definitely feel workshops like these should be a must for all historians. And Katie, I would like to hear your thoughts on this, and also like to hear whether or not you agree that these kind of workshops should be mandatory for the history department to really help history students, show them that they can combine their other facets of who they are to build a career within the field of history beyond being a teacher and beyond a government employee.
I do agree. I think that when we first start our degrees in history, a lot of us just kind of default to, are you going to work in a museum? Are you going to write? Or are you going to be a teacher?
Mm-hmm.
When there's really so many things that go into a history degree, there's public historians, there's military historians, there's the field is endless. But I
Yes.
think that having some guidance at the forefront when you go into that field is essential, because it really helps you figure out where you want your passion to take you. For me, I love writing, and I continue to do that for the remainder of my days, but I also have a passion for educating. So that's something that I'm currently still pursuing. But I think that having someone there to run those workshops, have that available to students, would definitely be a very valuable resource to help guide them through not just their academic career, but what they're going to do after they graduate as professional historians.
Yes, absolutely. And kind of a follow-up to that, networking is huge for historians. LinkedIn alone has been a huge boon for all of us. We've been able to meet so many incredible people in the field of history, fellow writers, fellow academics, some of whom are very close friends of ours. Shout out to Michael Stroud, Courtney Atkins, Lynn Marks, and many others, Anthony Tucker Jones, and Chrissy Riley, to name a few, and so many more. And again, Katie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how essential it is to begin networking, because networking does open opportunities. It does open doors.
I think it is essential. So much of our communication is now digital. And so, when we're portraying what we have to offer, our books, articles, things like that, the first place really to go is, your social platforms. You've got LinkedIn. A lot of people use Facebook. I have Facebook, Instagram, personal websites that promote, your work. And that way, that's really a huge positive platform that we can use is social networking. And I think that that's something maybe they could integrate into the workshops, because some people really don't know either how to use social media to
Mhm.
promote their work. It's also it can be very daunting and intimidating to use those platforms. So I think some guidance there would be helpful to young historians.
Yes, absolutely. And we're almost near the end of this incredible interview, Katie. There are 4 last questions left, so I'm going to combine them together. And these are the 2 last fan questions that I have for you. And I think these are very important. So, as authors and as researchers and as historians, there comes a point in time where we have to stop with the research and begin the writing process. And even when we're writing, we have to know when to stop writing. And that can be very difficult because we get so involved in the research, in what we've learned, that there's so much. And it's like we cannot, discard this. We cannot throw this away. But depending on what we are researching and what we're writing about, sometimes we have to. And then from that point, we just have to ensure that what we've written is satisfying for the readers as well as fellow historians. So, for your book about the warrior queens of Africa during the classical age, at what point in your journey with that book's creation did you know when to stop researching and stop writing? And when you were nearing the end, when did you know when to stop writing and just know that what you had written and what had been edited with your editor was not only true to your voice as the author and historian, but also was satisfying for both parties?
So there definitely were times where I had to step back from the writing, not so much because I was stumped by the content or, things like that, or didn't have resources to back up what I was writing about. It was more so taking a step back because I could feel my own moral compass.
Mm,
Some of the topics in this book are extremely sensitive, and you can't you can't help but feel a little bit grieved by what you're researching. For example, the Atlantic slave trade is in this book. It
right.
was very much prevalent during the reign of Anjinga, and that was very trying part of the researching process and the writing, where I felt very grieved by what humanity is capable of doing to each other. So in
Yes.
that scenario, I did have to take a step back for a couple days just to process my own subjectivity and then dive back into the context of the book and then write it the way it was, but leaving my own personal opinions and judgments about it out. And that is very difficult to do, especially when you're dealing with a very sensitive topic such as slavery and its worldwide impact. So that is definitely an example of that. And what was the second part of your question again?
The second part of the question was, so after the researching and going to the writing, and when you were nearing the end, at what point did you stop writing because you knew that this was the ending, that it was going to be, that it felt satisfying, not just for you as the author and historian, but also for other parties involved, from your editor, as well as your future readers and fellow historians who would be reading it as well?
So I was in constant communication with my editor. Whenever I had pieces of my book written, I would send it to her all throughout the process, so that one, the editing was less daunting going forward when you're nearing that completion. But also it gave my editor an opportunity to say, hey, I'm not really sure I'm understanding where you're going with this, or I don't really hear your natural writing voice. And it could have been a day that I was writing and I was mentally tired, or I was struggling with the content because it was difficult to read. But
Right.
so there was a lot of communication between me and Corinne, my editor, all throughout. So if something didn't sound right or it didn't flow right, she was always there to give me a lot of really wonderful guidance to make sure I was staying on topic, on track. It was easy to read and historically sound.
Nice. Very, very nice. And now we arrive at the final two questions of this incredible historian interview. So, with everything that we talked about throughout this interview, your goals as a historian, your passions as a writer, and your mission statement in life, at the end of the day, what do you want people to take away from this book, as well as your other scholarly work that you have written over the years?
Well, I do want to show people that they can have an appreciation for the past, the dark chapters, and the parts that are worth celebrating. Human history goes back a long time, and writing about history is more than just recounting the past. It's about helping people understand the complex forces that have shaped the world that we know today.
Absolutely. And the final question is this: with everything you've learned in your career thus far and will continue to learn, what is your word of wisdom to fellow historians and future historians listening to this interview or watching it right now?
I would say to remain as objective as possible. We cannot change the past, but we can educate for future generations. It's an honor to be able to do so. So take that responsibility and opportunity seriously.
Very true. Very, very true. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing historians interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. A huge thank you to my good friend Katy Clark for coming back on the show, telling us all about her books as well as her future plans down the road. Katy, thank you so much for coming back on the show again. Where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out, as well as buy a copy of your book? And also, are there personal shout outs you want to give to anyone who has helped you on your career?
Absolutely. First, I can be found on LinkedIn. I am also on Facebook and Instagram, and people can certainly find me on my website at remembertheladies.com. Huge shout out to my husband and my 4 kids. I would not be where I am today without their unwavering support and encouragement, along with my extended family, my parents, my brothers, my sisters. Everyone has been incredibly encouraging.
Awesome. Awesome. And your book, where can people buy a copy of your book?
They can buy it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. They can always go to Pen & Sword's website. And if you're overseas, I know that Blackwell's has it, Waterstones has it. There's many different avenues to purchase at.
Awesome. I will link that down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to learn more about Katy's book and some of the powerful women in that book in particular, I will also link Katy's Historians Lounge episode right here for you to go and check it out. It was a great discussion. We talked about a lot of great things, and probably, again, my favorite warrior queen in that book, which is the queen from the kingdom of Kush, which, if you haven't heard of her, I highly recommend researching her. She is a very fascinating figure. And as a little add-on to that, she is the only warrior queen to decapitate a Caesar. Now, it was the bust of Augustus, but still it was a powerful message to the Romans. So I highly encourage you to go and research her, as well as purchase a copy of Katy's book, which I'll provide the link down below. As always, everyone, thank you for your love and support. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with all new episodes coming out later this week, as well as the rest of the month. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter. And if you're an historian or an author, or possibly both, and would like to be featured on the channel in your own interview, go to my website at wanderingscribe.com to go to the Wandering Scribe tab. There you will find the application forms to fill out, and I'll be more than happy to get you on the show as quickly as I can. Until then, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all in the next episode.